Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. On this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, we listen into a discussion hosted at the University of Texas, Austin, featuring the Honorable Randall G. Schriver, the former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific and Security Affairs, now serving as the chairman of the Project 2049 Institute. Mr. Schriver served in his role in the Department of Defense from January 2018 to December 2019 and offers an overview of U.S. security relations throughout the Asia-Pacific region. He speaks of the continuity in policy between the Trump administration and the Biden administration, which may surprise some listeners. He also discusses issues such as human rights and democracy promotion, the role of India in the Quad, and supply chain security vis-a-vis China, as well as the adequacy of current and legacy force structures for dealing with the Chinese threat posed in the region. The talk is moderated by Jonathan Roberts. Let's listen in.
Hi, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm pleased to present this panel featuring the Honorable Randall Schriver. This panel will be moderated by Jonathan Roberts. Jonathan is a master's in global policy studies student at the LPJ School. He is also a Strauss Center Bremley Fellow, and I had the pleasure of having Jonathan work as my research assistant last summer, and I'm very excited that he'll be pursuing a career on Capitol Hill, working on national security when he graduates from the LPJ School. And with that, I'll let Jonathan take over moderating.
Hi, thank you so much for that, Dr. Amboden. Thanks to everyone for joining us today. It's my distinguished pleasure to welcome the Honorable Randall G. Schriver. Randall G. Schriver is the chairman of the board of the Project 2049 Institute. Most recently, Mr. Schriver served as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs from January 2018 through December 2019. Prior to his confirmation as Assistant Secretary, Mr. Schriver was a founding partner of Armitage International, a consulting firm that specializes in international business development and strategies. Mr. Schriver was also a founder of the Project 2049 Institute and served as President and CEO. Previously, Mr. Schriver served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. From 2001 to 2003, he served as Chief of Staff and Senior Policy Advisor to the Deputy Secretary of State. From 1994 to 1998, he worked in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, including as a senior official responsible for the day-to-day management of U.S. bilateral relations with the People's Liberation Army and the bilateral security and military relationship with Taiwan. Prior to civilian service, he served as an active duty naval intelligence officer from 1989 to 1991, including a deployment in support of Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm. After active duty, he served in the Navy Reserves for 9 years, including as special assistant to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and an attaché at U.S. Embassy Beijing and U.S. Embassy Ulaanbaatar. Mr. Schriver has won numerous military and civilian awards from the U.S. government and was presented while at the State Department with the Order of the Propitious Clouds by the President of Taiwan for service promoting U.S.-Taiwan relations. Mr. Schriver received a Bachelor of Arts degree in history from Williams College and a Master of Arts degree from Harvard University. And without further ado, Mr. Randall G. Schriver.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jonathan, for the nice introduction, and Dr. Amboden and everybody at University of Texas Strauss Center for inviting me. My only regret here today is I'm not joining you in person. I look forward to the opportunity to do that when conditions allow. But for today, we'll be virtual and look forward to this discussion on Indo-Pacific security. This is a region that is very dynamic and receiving a great deal of focus and attention from the new administration, which I'm grateful for. But I think this is really the region that will be largely the one that determines our future for better or for ill. And so it's appropriate that it is a priority area and a focus area of the administration. It's a region where we find over half the world's population, over a third of the global economy, 6 out of 7 of the world's strongest militaries, and all 5 of the globe's top 5 users of energy, and of course related top 5 emitters of carbon dioxide, respectively. So it's a region of tremendous weight for us across a variety of sectors and interest areas. And of course, it's an area where our greatest and most significant strategic competitor resides, the People's Republic of China. And also, we shouldn't underappreciate the fact that we are the United States, a Pacific nation. Sometimes where I sit in Washington, D.C., that is underappreciated, maybe the same in Austin, Texas. But all one needs to do is pull out a map and see that Great Aleutian Island chain from Alaska, how far that goes into the Asia portion of the Western Pacific. Look at Hawaii, where I'm from, and I know Dr. Imboden is from. Look at the great U.S. territories of Guam and American Samoa, which, by the way, territories that contribute more to the U.S. military per capita than most U.S. states. And you'll see that we are resident in the Pacific, and this is an area that we rightfully take interest in because we're part of it, in addition to all those significant factors I mentioned earlier. So this has been a focus area, at least for 3 administrations. And I think there's a great deal of continuity across 3 administrations if we include the beginning of the Biden administration. And that might sound a little funny because I think differences in tone and style and leadership and some of the pet issues of the previous administration would have us think at first glance it's very distinct and perhaps perturbations in policy. But in fact, I see a lot of continuity given these great interests, given our identity as a Pacific country. Remember, the Obama administration had what it called the pivot to Asia, and then later the rebalance of Asia, but basically making the point that this is an important region to us. The strategic guidance from the Obama administration was 60% of our naval forces were going to be in the Pacific. He worked on the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement, although didn't get it across the finish line, invested heavily in partners and allies, including important emerging partners like India, Indonesia, and Vietnam. So I think into the Trump administration, there was actually a great deal of continuity. And in many ways, President Trump was more evolutionary than revolutionary. And again, I think that may sound funny to some, but I think it's a very defensible statement, and I'll tell you why I see it that way. Again, the inheritance of the pivot to Asia, in many ways, the Trump administration made the pivot even more meaningful with its policy of promoting a free and open Indo-Pacific and resourcing that priority area in stronger ways than the previous administration. So the free and open Indo-Pacific policy that was enshrined in the Trump National Security Strategy and the National Defense Strategy had, I think, greater clarity, but many of the same themes and many of the same pillars as the previous administration. The greater clarity, of course, is found in how the previous administration spoke about China, being very direct, referring to China as a strategic competitor, and noting that the competitive aspects of our relationship were the defining qualities of that relationship, and that our challenge was really full spectrum, trying to keep the characters and qualities of the Indo-Pacific region free and open, and working with partners and like-minded countries to do that. So the previous administration, for example, named the Indo-Pacific region the priority theater. And I can tell you, working in the administration, it wasn't one of any priorities. It wasn't among priorities. It was the clear priority, and strategic competition with China was the organizing principle, not only for the department I worked in at the Department of Defense, but really across the U.S. government. So we recognize the necessity of competing more effectively and really developing a competitive posture that could be sustained across the years. We provided stronger and more direct support to Taiwan. That was in the form of not only military hardware, security assistance, but in terms of diplomatic support in the international community, high-level visits and exchanges. Secretary Health and Human Services, for example, made a cabinet-level visit to Taiwan prior to the end of the administration, and we worked very closely with them on response to COVID. We matured and helped grow those emerging partnerships that the Obama administration had themselves invested heavily in, like India and Vietnam. And the Trump administration gave unprecedented support to the Pacific Islands. And that was demonstrated in many ways, including a first ever meeting at the Oval Office with the presidents of Palau, the Marshall Islands, and the Federated States of Micronesia, absolutely unprecedented. So this was all done despite the efforts of the Chinese Communist Party to actively undermine that free and open order. It's a record that I think creates a strong inheritance for the Biden administration when they came in. As I said, in many ways, we're seeing great continuity in this new administration. I think some of the work on the Quad, for example, President Biden hosted a virtual meeting for the first time at the presidential level with the United States, himself, of course, India, Japan, and Australia. And I'm told they're working toward an in-person meeting of the Quad before the end of the year. They've had important 2+2 meetings, what's called 2+2 meetings, which means our Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense meeting together in person with their counterparts from Japan and Korea. There's been important work with India, first on our strategic relationship, and more recently helping them manage this terrible spike they've had with the COVID problem. And they've continued to prioritize our allies and partners in the region. The very first in-person visit to the White House in the Biden administration was from Prime Minister Suga of Japan. And related to China, a lot of the language has been adopted and reinforced and underscored by the Biden administration, whether that's the terminology of China being a strategic competitor, whether that's on human rights, continuing to refer to the situation in Xinjiang as a genocide, whether that's the work on tech competition and the work that the previous administration had done on what's called CFIUS reform, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, furthering that effort and doing a review on supply chain integrity and the like. So great continuity across the board, including with respect to our competition with China. Now, I do think the previous administration certainly had its weak points, and the Biden administration has wisely, in many ways, come in and cleaned some of that up. I think the burden sharing agreements with Japan and South Korea had become a huge irritant in the Trump administration. They were able to take care of that in relatively short order, and we now have agreements for our forces to be stationed there and equitable burden sharing agreements in place for several years out. That's a very positive development. I think in many ways on trade issues, the previous administration, due to the personal interests of the president, placed a lot of stock on trade deficits and wanted to see those diminished, even though some of his policies didn't result in that. And I think in the Biden administration, they're taking a more strategic view of trade, although we've yet to see exactly what a trade liberalization agenda might look like. I think they're also reprioritizing and trying to introduce human rights into some of the relationships. There may be some complications there, which we'll have to monitor and watch. And of course, they're taking a stronger interest in climate change and international cooperation. We note Secretary Kerry's visit to Shanghai to talk to Chinese counterparts about that, and President Biden's hosting of the summit just last week. So there are some differences among the areas of continuity that are important to note, but I think by and large, given our identity as a Pacific nation, given the weight of this region, given the dynamics of China as a competitor and a country that seeks to undermine the free and open order in many ways, this administration is trying to support policies that the previous administration and even the one before that initiated and put in place to make us a stronger and more effective competitor. So I'm of the view that the administration is off to a good start, and would give them credit for that, and have given them credit for that in congressional testimony recently. I think they're still putting people in place. We have very strong people like Kurt Campbell at the White House, but others have been named but not yet confirmed. I think a good team is forming. Ambassador Dan Crittenbrink will be nominated to be the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia. My friend Eli Ratner will be nominated and hopefully confirmed to be Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Affairs, my previous job. So as the team comes into place, they'll have an opportunity to look at that inheritance, see what should be sustained, preserved, and where some recalibrations might be needed. So rather than critique a new administration and criticize, I just think there are some remaining questions about how things will unfold, and particularly when there are disruptions to the status quo and challenges to the status quo, and how might they respond. So I'll just share with you a few things that are on my mind along those lines. I think there is some questions about priorities. Like I said, the previous administration was crystal clear that competition with China was the organizing principle and the true strategic priority, not one of many. But it remains to be seen if it will remain that sort of place of priority in the new administration, or whether other priorities will seep in and start to compete for time and attention and resources. While it's in word right now remaining a priority, we also need to see where resources go. The first defense budget will be a sort of flat budget and just slightly under rate of inflation, so perhaps a real decline. Not a drastic drop or precipitous drop that some had worried about in my community and among national security professionals. But what will that look like over time? I think there's a lot of discussion among Capitol Hill staff and others that the next budget might represent a pretty significant decline. I've heard as much as 10%. Is there fat in the defense budget? Surely. Can it come down and we can do things to invest smarter and wiser and get more out of less? It's possible, but I think we do well to remember the Obama administration, and really the main criticism of the pivot at the time was great policy, great strategy, under-resourced, and we don't always look serious, particularly when it comes to security commitments. So I think watching the resource question over time will be important. I think investing in partners and allies is a very good thing. I'll be interested to see how that sort of rhetorical position translates into real action, and what does that mean on the ground or on the high seas. Because I happen to think relations with allies and partners were pretty good under the previous administration, despite some of the appearances or despite some of the rhetoric at the highest level, which of course can cloud things. But in fact, we worked very closely with Japan, Australia, even the Philippines, despite some of President Duterte's ambivalence about the alliance. We certainly helped them in Marawi City with their counterterrorism problem, and we helped them deal with the encroachments of their EEZ in the West Philippine Sea, part of China's campaign to coerce the Philippines where disputed territories were concerned. So I'll be interested to see what that really looks like in practice and in implementation, and how allies and partners will truly be prioritized. I think there are some questions about how to maintain a military edge. I mentioned just the bottom line sort of resource question, what would happen to defense budgets, but there really are questions about how those resources are invested in the future. I was an advocate for the Pacific Deterrence Initiative that was included in the National Defense Authorization Act last year. It's a very important provision, and it basically says there will be portions of the Department of Defense budget that will be protected and walled off and will be dedicated to the Pacific and not elsewhere. But that number for PDI has been low in the first year. I think that's okay. I think it's important that it be established and we start to create precedent for spending in the Pacific in ways that make a difference in military terms. But over time, that needs to be resourced in the right way, and the right decisions need to be made about those investments. A lot of those investments wouldn't be particularly expensive or in military terms, high tech. We need forward deployed logistics and ammunition. We need to be able to have high degree of confidence that we can disperse and have diversification in the event of conflict or contingency with the Chinese. Remember, our posture in the Pacific remains largely a legacy posture of post-World War II and Korean War, where we are very heavily present in basically two places. We're very heavily present in the Korean Peninsula with close to 40,000 troops there, and we are very heavily present in Japan. And even within Japan, very heavily concentrated on Okinawa. So for a an environment where we are looking at ballistic and cruise missiles from our adversary, competitor, that really holds at risk all those forward deployed forces. So the game for us really becomes, how do we have confidence we can sustain a fight, survive, and then prevail in a range of known contingencies. And that's why I think something like the Pacific Deterrence Initiative is so important. There are questions about what does a post-INF world look like for the United States, the Intermediate Nuclear Weapons Agreement, where we agreed with the Soviet Union in 1987 to basically prohibit and outlaw a certain class of missile systems. We withdrew from that in the Trump administration because the Russians were non-compliant and were cheating. We probably would have stayed in had the Russians come into compliance. But the fact of the matter is getting out helps us vis-a-vis China, because China, having never been in INF, was in fact building its military power projection capability entirely on the backs of this particular class of missile, which we had outlawed. So we have a chance to not necessarily achieve parity in terms of numbers, but introduce a capability that can hold things at risk for China, capabilities that they've had, to hold things at risk for the United States. So those are ground-based systems. So there are geopolitical considerations. No decisions have been made about where such capabilities might be deployed, but all of us can pull out a map and have a pin and a string and start to figure out where the ranges would lead us to want to be. And so these are discussions we'll have to have with our partners and allies and see exactly what that post-INF world looks like and how that can maybe even out in many ways the security balance. As I said, the new administration is committed to reintroducing human rights as more important issues in our various relationships. I think the previous administration never fully neglected these issues, and in fact, with respect to China, was very strong, referring to Xinjiang as a genocide, putting sanctions in place, particularly global Magnitsky sanctions on individuals involved in the detention camps in Xinjiang, involved in the crackdown in Hong Kong. But in fact, in many areas across the region, human rights were raised, but not necessarily in consequential ways for some of our interlocutors. So I'll be curious to see not only how the administration picks up these issues related to China, and there's a big decision coming up on the Olympics. Would there be a boycott or maybe a diplomatic political boycott and allow the athletes to go? There are a number of proposals being kicked around. But I'm also very interested to see how this might apply to some of our emerging partners and allies. The Trump administration worked hard to, in fact, reverse some of the previous decisions. We resumed foreign military sales and resumed international military education training with Thailand, first time since the 2014 coup. We removed Kopassus in Indonesia off the list of entities we were not allowed to exercise with because of previous human rights considerations and the so-called Leahy laws. So we removed those restrictions and we started exercising with Kopassus in Indonesia. We were able to segregate in political ways the armed forces of the Philippines from the National Police of the Philippines, and say that the armed forces of the Philippines, and say so legitimately and with data and facts, that they were not involved in the extrajudicial killings in the Philippines related to the drug war there. And so we were able to have normal relations with the armed forces of the Philippines. We were able to grow our strategic partnership with India in ways that involved military and defense relations, increasing our number of exercises and military sales and the like. How will this new administration look at the various actions of the government in Delhi that have, in many ways, disadvantaged ethnic minorities and religious minorities, and their various moves in Kashmir? These are considerations if you're going to make human rights more meaningful in your policies and in your relationships. These are things that we'll want to understand and watch what it really looks like in practice. I think another area that we'll be watching closely is the technology competition with China. The tech competition is very real, and it's one that lends itself to cooperation with partners and allies, but it's also highly complicated. And when we look at things like supply chain integrity, and I just had a conversation with a group of students about this. It's probably unrealistic and even undesirable, given a market of 1.4 billion people, that we would decouple completely. But at the same time, there are probably critical sectors where we want to reduce our vulnerability by eliminating China as having a position in supply chain, or Chinese entities in our supply chain, both for the purposes of not making ourselves vulnerable to cutoff, but also there are certain sectors where if Chinese entities are in the supply chain, that also might give them access to particular technologies and know-how that we would otherwise rather prevent from being exported. So there's work to be done on the supply chain integrity. There's work to be done on the tech competition, but it has to be done in ways that are mindful of not harming our businesses. Many of our companies that have cooperation with China and are involved in production through their supply chains are also the same companies that themselves are national security contributors through their own innovation and research and development and own support and sales to the U.S. government and the U.S. Department of Defense. So untangling all that is pretty difficult, but we certainly don't want to do it in a way that ultimately comes back and hurts our own national security by harming the companies that themselves are national security contributors to the United States. So that all needs to be done, I think, with some care. And as I said, it very much involves partners and allies. Rather than completely onshoring or reshoring some of our supply chains, it probably makes more sense to just diversify and have countries and entities in our supply chains that are really from more reliable partners and are unlikely to cut us off. And in particular sectors, that's probably the only realistic option, like semiconductors, when you find that Taiwan produces over half the world's semiconductors right now. And in rare earths, where, although a bit of a misnomer, rare earths, turns out they're not that rare, but they are difficult to extract, a lot of upfront costs, and they're extraordinarily difficult to refine and process, particularly given environmental considerations. So a lot of that work needs to be done with great care, and it's probably not going to be the United States alone. It's going to be with partners and allies. So the tech competition is one where I think we'll have to spend some time and get the nuances right. I made mention of the Quad before. I think the Quad is a potentially significant development, but we have to give it an agenda. We have to make it meaningful. I think the first meeting that President Biden hosted with Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Suga and Mr. Morrison in Australia, I think was highly effective because they had an agreed upon agenda to talk about vaccine distribution and COVID relief. Over time, will there be a security agenda added to that? I'm hopeful that there will be, and I think there is the potential for that. I'm one that looks at the founding of the Quad as really having taken place on December 26, 2004. That's the date of the great Southeast Asian tsunami and the great humanitarian tragedy there. It was those four countries, the United States, Japan, Australia, and India, that collectively responded as a contact group of four to that humanitarian tragedy. And it's because we had the capability, but we also had the values that compelled us to want to respond. We had the political will, and we were able to muster a response. All of those factors and all those conditions are still in place. But how do we operationalize that again beyond just waiting for another humanitarian crisis? How do we actually cooperate in ways that are meaningful to sustaining a peaceful environment and a free and open Indo-Pacific? I mentioned a bit about trade. The Trump administration, I would critique and say in many ways fell short. The administration started by pulling out of TPP, something I supported. I supported TPP, and said we were going to do bilateral trade. But in fact, we did a repeal and not a replace. We repealed TPP, and then we're very slow to come around on bilateral trade agreements. The focus was frankly elsewhere, creating mechanisms to better support the private sector, which I think were successful. Working with the Congress on the BUILD Act, for example, to create the Development Finance Corporation is a significant move, and it allows us to support U.S. private sector in our overseas investment strategy. But in many ways, we never fully came to the fore with a trade strategy, certainly not a multilateral trade liberalization strategy. We've heard virtually nothing from the Biden administration on this, and I'm sure that reflects the politics of trade, which historically the Democrats have wrestled with quite a bit. But at some point, something has to be decided, because trade and commerce is really the lifeblood of Asia and the Indo-Pacific region. And countries are not waiting for us to figure this out. They're moving out on their own with Japan's led TPP-11, the TPP effort minus the U.S. China has promoted its own trade regime. So at some point, even standing in place and not declaring a policy leaves you standing on the sidelines watching others move forward. So that's another thing to watch and see what kind of trade strategy the administration will come forward. I think engagement with Taiwan is another important area to watch. The Biden administration just sent a high-level delegation of former officials and political figures. Chris Dodd, former senator, Jim Steinberg, and Rich Armitage, both former deputy secretaries of state, were in Taiwan 2 weeks ago. But I think Taiwan will be under increasing pressure from the People's Republic of China. We're seeing more flights across the center line and around the island of Taiwan. We're seeing pressure in other ways, trying to strip Taiwan of its diplomatic allies. And in many ways, Xi Jinping, although he hasn't declared a timeline or a deadline, he has been very clear that unification with Taiwan is part of the great national rejuvenization which he seeks. And there is somewhat of a timeline on that. He talks about 2049 being the year of China having a world-class military and coming into the realization of that era of great national rejuvenization. So Taiwan is something that I think we'll watch, and we'll be very interested in how the Biden administration will continue to support Taiwan in its international space and its security needs and the like. You know, I've talked about just about everything related to China, but there are other issues out there in the Indo-Pacific. And a big one is North Korea and what should be done about the nuclear program there and the security threat of not only North Koreans posing to South Korea and the region, but the threat of proliferation, the ongoing human rights tragedy there. I participated in not only the policy development, but our efforts at diplomacy with North Korea in the Trump administration. I represented DOD during the negotiations and traveled to Pyongyang and was present at both summits in Singapore and Hanoi. And I'm here to tell you, although I suppose the diplomacy stabilized things in a way and reduced tensions in a way, we did not make progress on the nuclear issue or related military systems for delivery and the like. That puts us in good company with every other administration. We've now seen just about everything tried: 4-party talks, 6-party talks, so-called strategic patience, ignoring North Korea with the Trump administration, leader-to-leader engagement, high-level diplomacy. We've seen virtually everything tried and nothing having been successful. So the Biden administration will have to make some decisions. I'd personally like to see a return to something resembling maximum pressure. I think in a way going to leader engagement early in the Trump administration. In some ways, we sacrificed the benefits of keeping pressure on that we may have realized. That's a judgment call for history. But I think we certainly had a coordinated policy with friends, allies, and even China at a point to put pressure on the regime in North Korea. And I think trying to reconstitute that in some form is probably the best course. But again, that's something more to watch and learn about as their review is underway than to say at this point we know what that outcome will be. So I realize I've put more questions on the table and shared with you things that I'll be watching and things that I'm interested in, rather than really strong declaratory policies of my own. But hopefully that's enough to spark interest and lead us into a discussion. I'm happy to answer questions or receive your comments or criticism. And again, my only regret is not being there in person to have this exchange, but I do look forward to it. So thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.